Hey everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we're going somewhere very old and very ordinary, which is usually where the most interesting things are hiding. We're going to spend a day inside a Roman house. Not as the owner. Not as the guest reclining on the good couch with a cup of watered wine and opinions about the fish sauce. We're going in through the back, before sunrise, with the person who lit the lamps. Before we settle in, take a second, and if you genuinely enjoy these, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. Only if you mean it. And let me know down in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always lovely to see how many corners of the world are quietly awake, or quietly falling asleep, at the same moment. Now dim the lights. Turn on the fan if that soft background hum helps you drift. Get comfortable. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. I want to be honest with you at the very start, because it shapes everything that follows. Not one enslaved Roman woman left us an account of her own life in her own words. Not one. Everything we know about her comes to us secondhand, filtered through people who owned her, sold her, joked about her, or listed her among the farm equipment. Roman literature was written almost entirely by elite men, and when enslaved women appear in it, they usually appear as furniture, as punchlines, or as objects of desire. So we have to work differently tonight. We have to build her out of fragments. A tombstone with her name misspelled. A legal ruling about who owed what to whom when she was injured. A farming manual that lists her duties between the storage of vinegar and the cleaning of the stables. A room in Pompeii with 3 beds in it and a chamber pot under the smallest one. This is a reconstruction, and I'll tell you clearly, as we go, which parts are documented and which parts are careful inference. Because she deserves accuracy more than she deserves a good story. Let's give her a name, and let's borrow a real one. In the year 2 BC, in Rome, a woman died who had been enslaved to a mistress named Pieres. Her name was known. Somebody, either her owner or the other slaves who worked beside her, paid for a small marble slab to mark her burial niche, and on that slab they carved 4 things: her name, the name of the woman who owned her, the fact that she was an ancilla, and the fact that she was an ornatrix. A slave woman. A hairdresser. And then, unusually, they carved the exact date she was carried out for burial, which works out to the 28th of January. The carving isn't fine work. Whoever paid for it did not have deep pockets. And that's essentially the whole of what survives of a human life. A name, a job, an owner, and a date. Tonight we are going to try to put a day around that. So, where does a woman like Nome come from in the first place? There were 4 main roads into Roman slavery, and the proportion shifted over the centuries. The oldest and most dramatic was war. Rome's conquests dragged enormous numbers of captives back into Italy, and in the last 2 centuries before the empire this was the main engine of supply. But war is unreliable as a business model, and as the conquest slowed, the other roads mattered more. There was piracy and kidnapping, which never really stopped along the coasts and the frontiers. There was the abandonment of unwanted infants, who could be picked up and raised as property. There was debt and desperation, with people selling their children or occasionally themselves. And then there was the quietest source of all, and probably the largest by the imperial period, reproduction. A child born to an enslaved mother was born enslaved, full stop, regardless of who the father was. The Romans had a word for a slave born in the house, and the word was verna. Verni were often thought of as more loyal, more trustworthy, more properly domesticated, which tells you something uncomfortable about how the whole arrangement was understood. If Nome was a verna, then she never had a moment of freedom to remember and lose. This was simply the shape of the world she opened her eyes into. If she was bought rather than born, she went through a market, and Roman slave markets were regulated with the unsettling thoroughness of a used car dealership. The dealer hung a placard around each person's neck, called a titulus, listing origin, skills, health, and any known defects. Imported slaves, according to several ancient descriptions, had one foot whitened with chalk to mark them out from locally sourced ones. Buyers inspected bodies the way you'd inspect livestock, and the aediles who policed the markets issued edicts requiring dealers to disclose illnesses and tendencies to run away, with the buyer entitled to return the goods if a hidden fault turned up later. Read that sentence again slowly. There was a legally enforceable returns policy. Rome's genius for administration did not pause for sentiment. Prices varied enormously by skill, age, and appearance, and our figures are scattered and hard to compare across centuries, so treat any single number with caution. What we can say confidently is that a trained specialist cost far more than an unskilled laborer, and that the very expensive end of the market involved young people prized for beauty or for accomplishments like music. Much later, in the price edict issued under Diocletian in the year 301, a male slave between 16 and 40 was capped at 30,000 denarii and a woman of the same age at 25,000, with skilled workers allowed to go substantially higher. Those are ceiling prices from a period of severe inflation rather than everyday street prices, so they tell us about relative value more than absolute cost. A woman who could dress hair, keep accounts, weave fine cloth, or nurse an infant was worth a great deal more than a woman who could only carry things. Now let's begin the day. And the first thing to understand is that a Roman day does not begin when your alarm goes off, because there is no alarm and there are no fixed hours. Romans divided daylight into 12 hours from sunrise to sunset, which means that an hour in June is a substantially longer thing than an hour in December. Time stretched and contracted with the seasons. In a household with money there might be a sundial in the garden or a water clock indoors, and in the forum a public official would announce the key hours aloud. But for most people the clock was the sky, the roosters, the noise of carts, and the internal timing of someone who has done the same work every day since childhood. She wakes before the household. That is not a guess. That is the entire logic of domestic service, and it is what every ancient description of a well-run house assumes. The house must be warm, lit, watered and functioning before the people who own it open their eyes. Where does she wake up? For a long time this was one of the great blanks in our knowledge, and then in November of 2021 archaeologists working at a villa in Civita Giuliana, a few hundred meters northwest of the walls of Pompeii, opened a room that had been sealed by the eruption of Vesuvius. It was about 16 square meters. Inside were 3 wooden beds, one of them child-sized, made of rope stretched over plank frames. There was a chamber pot. There was a wooden chest with metal and fabric objects inside. There were amphorae pushed underneath the beds and used for storing personal belongings, and there were ceramic jugs. The only natural light came from one small window set high in the wall. There was no decoration of any kind, not a painted line, and part of a chariot shaft was stored in the same space, because the room doubled as a place to keep things. The director of the site described it as something between a dormitory and a storeroom, and called it one of the most exciting discoveries of his career precisely because there was no treasure in it at all. The treasure was the human evidence. Sit with that image for a moment, because it is the truest picture we have. 3 beds. One of them small enough for a child. A pot. A chest. A high window admitting a grey rectangle of pre-dawn. And whatever conversation happened in that room in the dark, before the work started, is gone forever. She dresses, which takes no time because she owns a tunic and possibly a second tunic. Roman clothing was overwhelmingly a matter of woolen and linen tunics, longer for women, and the enslaved wore what the working poor wore. And here is one of the most revealing details in all of Roman social history. Seneca records that a proposal was once floated in the Senate to make slaves wear a distinctive uniform so they could be identified on sight. It was rejected, and the reason given was that if slaves could recognize one another at a glance, they would also be able to count themselves and discover how many they were. Rome preferred its enslaved population invisible, blended into the crowd, unable to see its own size. Estimates for that size remain genuinely contested among historians, with figures for the empire as a whole usually landing somewhere around 10 to 20% of the population, and figures for Italy in the early imperial period sometimes proposed much higher, though those higher numbers are debated and rest on fragile evidence. What everyone agrees on is that the number was enormous, and that Rome was nervous about it. The first chores are the elemental ones: fire, water, light. The kitchen hearth has to be brought back from embers or restarted, which in a world without matches means either coaxing last night's coals or borrowing flame from a neighbor, and it is slow, smoky, kneeling work. The lamps have to be trimmed and filled with olive oil, and Roman oil lamps produce a small, wavering, sooty light that blackens ceilings over the years and requires constant tending. Anyone who has read about the elegance of Roman interiors should picture them properly, half in shadow, smelling faintly of burnt oil, with the good frescoes lit by something not much brighter than a candle. Then water. Rome had 11 aqueducts by the imperial period, and they are rightly famous, but running water pipe directly into a private house was a privilege of the wealthy and the well-connected. The vast majority of households sent someone to a public fountain, and that someone was almost never the head of the household. So she goes out into the half-dark street with a jar, and this is where the day's geography opens up. The streets before dawn belonged to delivery carts, which were banned from much of Rome during daylight hours by legislation going back to Julius Caesar, so the nights were noisy with wheels and the mornings were loud with unloading. Bakers have been working for hours. The fountain has a queue, and the queue is other people exactly like her, from other houses, and this is where information moves. We have no transcript of those conversations. But every society organized around domestic service develops an information network among the servants, and there is no plausible reason Rome was an exception. Consider that inference rather than fact, though a very well-founded one. Back inside, the house wakes. And here we need to talk about hierarchy, because one of the biggest misconceptions about Roman slavery is that it was a single condition. It was not. In a large elite household, the enslaved staff was specialized to a degree that borders on the absurd, and we know this because a woman named Susan Tregiri did the patient, unglamorous work of reading through the funerary inscriptions from the household of Livia, the wife of Augustus, and cataloging the job titles. There was the ornatrix who dressed hair. There was the sarsenatrix who mended clothing. There was the vestiplica who folded and cared for garments. There was the lanipendia who weighed out wool to be spun and kept track of what came back. There were nurses, midwives, wardrobe keepers, mirror holders, jewelry keepers, masseuses, readers, secretaries, and people whose entire recorded function was the care of a specific category of object. A great house was a machine with an extraordinary number of small human parts. And this specialization created rank. The woman who touched the mistress's hair every morning occupied a completely different social world from the woman who carried out the chamber pots, and both of them were legally identical property. That gap mattered enormously in daily life and not at all in law, and the tension between those two facts runs through everything. Let's say our woman is an ornatrix, like gnome. Her mourning is the mistress's toilette, and it is the most delicate assignment in the house. Roman women's hairstyles in the late Republic and early Empire were, at the top of society, architectural. We know this from portrait sculpture, and for a very long time scholars assumed the more elaborate examples had to be wigs, because nobody could work out how you'd build such a thing out of real hair and keep it standing. Then a hairdresser from Baltimore named Janet Stevens got interested in the problem, and this is one of my favorite stories in the whole of classical scholarship. Working from the sculptures and from the Latin texts, she noticed that the word accuse, which appears in Ovid and Juvenal in hairdressing contexts, was being routinely translated as hairpin. But accuse can also mean a needle, as in needle and thread. She tried it. She sewed the braids into place. And the styles held, on real hair, without wigs, exactly as the marble portraits show them. She published in a peer-reviewed classics journal, and the reconstruction has been widely accepted since. Which means that when we picture the ornatrix at work, we should not picture someone fussing with pins. We should picture someone stitching, with a needle, into a living structure of hair, kneeling or standing for a long time, with her hands very close to the face of a woman who has total legal power over her. And that proximity was dangerous. Roman literature is oddly consistent on this point. Ovid, in the Amores, describes a mistress who tears at her hairdresser and scratches her. Martial has a character named Lalage who strikes her ornatrix with a mirror because of a misplaced curl, and Juvenal, in his sixth satire, gives us the unlucky slave girl Seekers, doing her mistress's hair with her own scalp torn and her own clothing pulled down, while the mistress rages at her over the arrangement of a single lock. Now, satire exaggerates. That is its job, and Juvenal in particular is a professional exaggerator with an axe to grind about women. But three separate authors in three separate genres reach for the same image, which strongly suggests the image was recognizable to their audiences. Casual violence against the woman doing your hair was a thing people had seen. And there is a special cruelty in that particular arrangement. The labor that made an elite woman beautiful was performed by someone who could be hit for the result. Ovid also gives us, elsewhere in the Amores, a hairdresser named Sypassus, whom the poet is accused of sleeping with. He protests his innocence in terms that are worth quoting for what they reveal rather than what they claim. What free man, he asks, would want to embrace a back marked by the whip? He is defending himself by expressing disgust at the idea. He is also, in passing, telling us that a hairdresser's back might routinely be scarred, and that everyone knew it. That is the kind of detail that slips out sideways in ancient sources, and it's often more reliable than what the author is actually trying to say. By mid-morning the household's rhythm changes. The master, if he is a man of any standing, has received his morning callers in the atrium, the clients who come to pay respects and ask for favors, and the enslaved staff have been managing that traffic, opening the door, announcing names, remembering faces, keeping the wrong people out. Then the house settles into production, and for women that overwhelmingly means textiles. Woolwork, lanificum, sat at the absolute center of the Roman ideal of womanhood. The highest compliment you could pay a Roman matron on her tombstone was that she was chaste, she stayed home, and she made wool. There's a famous archaic epitaph that reduces an entire life to almost exactly those words. Even the imperial family performed it. Augustus made a public point of wearing clothes supposedly woven at home by the women of his household, which was propaganda, and everybody knew it was propaganda, and it worked anyway. But here's the thing about an ideal that everyone praises: somebody has to actually do it. And the actual spinning, carding, weaving, dyeing and mending in a wealthy house was done by enslaved women, sitting for hours at the vertical loom or with the spindle, while the ideal accrued to the woman who supervised. The lanipendier weighed out the raw wool in the morning and weighed the yarn back in at the end, which is a quota system, and quota systems exist because someone is checking. It is slow, repetitive, hand-numbing work, and it is also the kind of work that permits talk. Spinning does not require silence. So if you want a picture of what most of the daylight hours of most enslaved Roman women actually looked like, it is not drama. It is a room with a loom in it, wool dust in the air, hands moving in patterns learned in childhood, and conversation, and the sound of the street outside. Grinding, monotonous, and survivable. Food punctuates the day, and it was not lavish. Romans generally ate a slight breakfast called the ientaculum, often just bread, sometimes with olives or cheese, a light midday prandium, and then the cena in the late afternoon or evening, which was the real meal and, for the wealthy, the social event. For the enslaved, the shape was the same but the contents were thinner. Cato the Elder, writing a farming manual in the 2nd century before the Common Era, lists rations for agricultural slaves with the tenderness of a man calculating feed costs, set amounts of wheat or bread depending on whether they were chained or unchained and how hard they were working, a measure of olives or, when the olives ran out, fish pickle and vinegar, a small allowance of oil, a fixed quantity of salt for the year, and cheap wine, including a batch made by pouring water over pressed grape skins. Cato also advises selling off old oxen, sick sheep, and old or sickly slaves, in a single list, in the same tone. That passage has appalled readers for 2,000 years and it was not written to appall anyone. It was written as good advice. Urban household slaves generally ate better than that, and there's archaeological support. The excavations at Pompeii and its surrounding villas have turned up storage in slave spaces containing beans and fruit, which suggests a diet with more in it than the bare minimum. The reasoning was straightforwardly economic. A domestic slave was an expensive asset in constant contact with the family, and starving her damaged the investment. That is not kindness. It is maintenance. But it does mean we should not imagine every enslaved person in permanent famine. Many were fed adequately and worked to exhaustion, which is its own kind of grim. In the afternoon, if her mistress goes to the baths, she goes too. Roman bathing was a social ritual and a logistical operation, and the attendants carried the oil flasks and the strigils. The curved metal scrapers used to take off the oil and dirt, and they guarded the clothes, because bath thieves were a recognized urban plague. She may have bathed herself, in whatever water and whatever moment was available. She spent the visit standing, holding things, waiting. And then there is the evening meal, which for a household that entertains is the most demanding performance of the day. A Roman dinner party was theater, and the enslaved staff were the stagehands and the scenery at once. Food carried in, wine mixed with water in the correct proportion because drinking it unmixed was considered barbaric, hands washed between courses, couches adjusted, lamps tended, everything moving smoothly and silently. We have an extraordinary document about this, and it's worth dwelling on because it is the closest thing Roman literature offers to a conscience. Seneca, in the 47th of his Moral Letters, writes to a friend about how to treat slaves. He describes the dinner party from the server's point of view, the young man standing all night in the smoke, not permitted to speak, not permitted to cough or sneeze or hiccup, punished for any sound that breaks the silence, carving the meat with practiced gestures while the diners eat past the point of comfort. Seneca insists that slaves are human beings, that they are fellow slaves in the deeper sense because fortune has power over everyone, that a master should eat with them and let them speak. It is a genuinely moving letter. And it stops precisely where you want it to keep going, because Seneca does not conclude that slavery should be abolished. He concludes that it should be conducted decently. That was the outer edge of what even the most humane Roman thinkers could imagine, and it is important to see the edge clearly rather than to pretend it wasn't there. Now, I've been describing a city house, but a great many enslaved women lived on farms, and the rural picture is different in ways that matter. On an estate, the senior enslaved woman was the vilica, partner to the vilicus, and Cato lists the pair among the equipment necessary for an olive farm, which is exactly as dehumanizing as it sounds. Columella, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, devotes far more space to her, and for a long time historians read that material through a Greek passage Columella quotes at the start and concluded that the vilica was essentially a housekeeper. Recent scholarship has been overturning that reading, and I want to flag this as current and evolving rather than settled. A paper published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology in 2026 argues that historians were misled by that Greek quotation, which Columella himself explicitly attributes to someone else writing for centuries earlier and in a different context. Seneca, in the 47th of his Moral Letters, writes to a friend about how to treat slaves. He describes the dinner party from the server's point of view: the young man standing all night in the smoke, not permitted to speak, not permitted to cough or sneeze or hiccup, punished for any sound that breaks the silence, carving the meat with practiced gestures while the diners eat past the point of comfort. Seneca insists that slaves are human beings, that they are fellow slaves in the deeper sense because fortune has power over everyone, that a master should eat with them and let them speak. It is a genuinely moving letter. And it stops precisely where you want it to keep going, because Seneca does not conclude that slavery should be abolished. He concludes that it should be conducted decently. That was the outer edge of what even the most humane Roman thinkers could imagine, and it is important to see the edge clearly rather than to pretend it wasn't there. Now, I've been describing a city house, but a great many enslaved women lived on farms, and the rural picture is different in ways that matter. On an estate, the senior enslaved woman was the vilica, partner to the vilicus, and Cato lists the pair among the equipment necessary for an olive farm, which is exactly as dehumanizing as it sounds. Columella, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, devotes far more space to her, and for a long time historians read that material through a Greek passage Columella quotes at the start and concluded that the vilica was essentially a housekeeper. Recent scholarship has been overturning that reading, and I want to flag this as current and evolving rather than settled. A paper published in the Journal of Roman Archaeology in 2026 argues that historians were misled by that Greek quotation, which Columella himself explicitly attributes to someone else writing for centuries earlier and in a different context. The floor was cut with grooves designed to keep blindfolded donkeys walking in a fixed circular path, turning millstones, and enslaved people worked in that circle alongside the animals. There is no ambiguity in that architecture. It was built to contain human beings and extract labor from them until they stopped working. Bread, the most basic and comforting object in the Roman diet, came out of rooms like that. Fulling, the cleaning and finishing of cloth, was similar in a different register. Workers trod fabric in vats of stale urine collected from public pots, because the ammonia lifted grease, and Vespasian famously taxed the collection and defended the tax by observing that money doesn't smell. So the range is enormous. A trusted hairdresser sewing pearls into her mistress's braids and a woman walking in circles in a dark room with a donkey were the same thing under the law, and that brings us to the part of this we can't step around. The legal architecture is simple and total. An enslaved person was property, res, a thing. She could not legally own anything, though in practice she might be allowed to accumulate a fund called a peculium which everyone treated as hers and which technically belonged to her owner. She could not make a contract in her own name. She could not legally marry. enslaved couples formed stable, loving, lifelong partnerships all the time, and the Romans even had a word for such a union, contubernium, but it carried no legal weight, which meant it could be dissolved at any moment by a sale. Children born of that union belonged to the mother's owner, and could be sold away, and were. Funerary inscriptions record enslaved parents burying children, enslaved daughters living out their lives alongside enslaved fathers, families that held together against the odds. They also, by their rarity, hint at how many did not. Punishment. Roman owners could beat, brand, chain, and confine. Fugitives could be tattooed on the forehead, and we have surviving iron collars, riveted permanently shut, with bronze tags reading essentially "Hold me if I run, and return me to my master, and you'll be rewarded." One of the best known, the Zoninus collar, dates to the 4th or 5th century. These were not standard equipment for all enslaved people. Scholars generally read them as a punishment applied to those who had already tried to escape. And then there is the single most chilling piece of Roman law on this subject, the Senatus Consultum Silanianum. It held that if a master was murdered in his home, all the slaves living under that roof could be interrogated under torture and put to death, on the reasoning that they should have died defending him. In the year 61, the city prefect Pedanius Secundus was killed by one of his own slaves. Under the rule, his entire urban household faced execution, 400 people, including women and children. Tacitus records that a crowd gathered in protest, that the Senate debated it, and that one senator argued the old custom must be upheld precisely because the enslaved could only be controlled through fear. The Senate agreed. Troops lined the route. The sentence was carried out. 400 people, of whom we know not one name. Set against that, there was a slow, partial, genuinely real current of legal reform running the other way, and honesty requires including it. Under Claudius, an owner who abandoned a sick slave rather than treat them lost their claim, and the person, if they recovered, became free. Hadrian restricted an owner's right to kill and limited the sale of slaves into gladiator schools and brothels without cause. Antoninus Pius ruled that a master who killed his own slave without justification could be punished as if he had killed someone else's. And then there is one festival I find genuinely remarkable, on the 7th of July, called the Noni Capretini, also known as the Ancillarum Fyrii, the festival of the slave women. On that day enslaved women were permitted to dress in fine clothing, to feast in the open beneath a wild fig tree, to run about and mock and jest and playfully strike at one another and at others. Our sources connect it to Juno and to a legend about a slave woman, called Tucula or Philotis in different tellings, who saved Rome by climbing a fig tree and signaling the army. That origin story is legend rather than history, and I want to be clear about that. But the festival itself is attested, and it means that in the Roman calendar there was one day in the year with the words "the holiday of the slave women" written on it. What that day actually felt like to the women it belonged to, no source tells us. I've often wondered. There was also hope, and it was not a fantasy. Roman slavery was unusual among slave systems in the frequency of manumission, and that fact shaped the psychology of the whole institution. Through the peculium, a trusted slave could accumulate savings, and with the owner's agreement could purchase freedom, or be freed by will, or be freed as a reward. The legal machinery around this was elaborate, a law of the year for restricted informal manumission of anyone under 30, creating a half-status called Junian Latin with limited rights, and another law limited how many slaves could be freed in a will, because the state worried about the flood of new citizens. Which tells you how common the practice had become. A formerly freed slave of a Roman citizen became a Roman citizen. Not fully equal, freed status carried a permanent social stain and barred certain offices, and the children were the ones who arrived clean, but a citizen. Freedom came with strings. The freedwoman, the liberta, owed her former owner, now her patron, defined duties and a defined number of days of labor, called operi, and continuing deference. A freedwoman was constrained in whom she could marry. If she had been freed in order to marry her patron, she could not simply leave him. Freedom in Rome was less a door you walked through than a door that opened onto a hallway with its own rules. But it happened, and it changed lives, and we can watch it happen in stone. There is a funerary tablet from Rome, elegantly carved in Augustan-style capitals with the letters picked out in red, for a woman named Dorcas. She was born a Verna on the imperial estate on the island of Capri, trained as an ornatrix, and freed by Livia, the wife of Augustus, which means there is a real chance that the hands that arranged the hair of the first empress of Rome belonged to this woman. She married a man named Lycastus, also freed from the imperial household, who held a minor official post. He set up the tablet and he called her his wife, using the proper legal word, coniugi, a word that would have been unavailable to either of them a few years earlier. You can feel the pride in the stone. Two people who had been property, using the vocabulary of legitimate Roman marriage about each other, in public, in permanent letters, framed with little Corinthian columns because they wanted it to look nice. Let's come back to the house one last time, because the day is ending. The evening meal is cleared. The lamps are carried through the rooms and most of them are put out, because oil costs money. The doors are barred. In a city apartment or a modest house the noise doesn't stop, because Rome at night was loud with the carts that were banned during the day, and Roman writers complain about the racket with the fervor of people who have not slept properly in years. She goes back to the small room with the high window. Whatever she owns is in a chest or an amphora under the bed. If she is fortunate, she shares that room with people she loves, and if she is very fortunate, they are still there in a year. And here is what I keep circling back to. Everything we've reconstructed tonight came from scraps that survived by accident. A volcano froze one room at one moment. A dry climate in Egypt preserved a nursing contract. A satirist reaching for a cheap laugh accidentally recorded that hairdressers got beaten. A farming manual, written to help landowners make money, preserved the job description of a woman whose name it never bothered to record. And most of all, tombstones. Small, cheap, often badly cut, often misspelled, paid for by other poor people scraping together the cost of a slab. There's a tablet for a girl called Veneria, a Verna in the house of a woman named Claudia Helpis, who had herself once been enslaved and had been freed, and who paid for her marble and had the letters traced in red. There's one for a child called Eutychia, with a funeral garland drawn on it in red ink because a carved one cost more. There's one for an infant named Stratonus at Ostia, dedicated by two men with Greek names who both called her their dearest daughter and both paid for her burial, which raises questions the stone does not answer and which is, in its own way, a small monument to how enslaved people built families out of whatever materials the system left them. And there is Marshall's Erosion, a little girl born in his house, who died 6 days before her 6th birthday, and for whom he wrote 3 poems and bought a burial plot on the Appian Way and asked the earth to lie lightly on her, since she had lain so lightly on it. Most enslaved children in Rome received no marker at all. They were wrapped in cloth and put in a shallow pit wherever there was room. So every one of these stones is an exception, and every exception is somebody deciding, at real cost, that a particular person would not be allowed to vanish. Which brings us back to Nome. Slave of Pieres. Hairdresser. Carried out for burial on the 28th of January in the year 2 before the Common Era. We don't know where she was born or how old she was or whether she had children or what she thought about while she was sewing braids into place. We know that in a city of 1 million people, at least one person cared enough to pay a not very good stonecutter to record that she had existed. And it worked. That's the part one want to leave you with as you drift off. 2027 years later, in a language she never heard, on a device she could not have imagined, in a country she never knew existed, somebody said her name out loud. The senator who ordered 400 people killed to make a point about discipline is a footnote. Nome is the story. History has a strange sense of humor about who it decides to keep. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. If this one gave you something to think about, or simply helped you rest, please do like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments where in the world you are and what the hour is where you're lying. I read them, and it is genuinely one of my favorite parts of doing this. Sleep well. Be gentle with yourself. And I'll see you in the next one.